Canada just launched a 306 million Canadian dollars steel pipe push in Sault Ste. Marie, and it could shape the energy projects you pay for, work on, and depend on. Your bills, your jobs, and your country's leverage in a tariff fight are tied to a factory most people have never heard of. It looks like one local mill upgrade, but it may be Canada's clearest move yet to rebuild steel power before the next shock hits. And the proof is not in a slogan. It is in the money, the tariffs, the jobs, and the production line Canada is now trying to control. The announcement happened in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, a steel city that knows what industrial pressure feels like. Tenaris announced a 306 million Canadian dollar modernization of its Sault Ste. Marie Industrial Centre on May 22, 2026, with support from both the federal government and Ontario. This was not a quiet corporate update. Melanie Joly was there, Doug Ford was there, Vic Fedeli was there, Terry Sheehan was there, Mayor Matthew Shoemaker was there. That tells you something. When that many political figures gather around one steel pipe investment, the story is bigger than one factory. It is about energy. It is about trade. It is about tariffs. It is about whether Canada can build the materials it needs inside its own borders when the global steel market turns hostile. Tenaris is not just upgrading a plant. It is expanding a key part of Canada's OCTG and line pipe supply chain. OCTG means Oil Country Tubular Goods. In plain English, these are the steel pipes used in oil and gas wells. They are the pipes that go into drilling, production, transport, shale projects, thermal projects, offshore projects, and other energy infrastructure. These are not ordinary tubes sitting in a warehouse. They are part of the physical backbone of energy. If a country wants to drill, move, and export energy, it needs pipe. If a country wants to build pipelines, expand production, or support major oil and gas projects, it needs pipe. If a country wants to be less exposed to foreign supply during a trade fight, it needs domestic pipe capacity. That is why this announcement matters. Tenaris is Canada's key domestic OCTG supplier and its only seamless pipe manufacturer. In Sault Ste. Marie alone, it employs about 800 people. The expansion is expected to add about 200 more jobs and increase annual domestic seamless and welded pipe output by roughly 80%. Ontario is backing the project with a conditional loan of up to 72 million Canadian dollars. Local reporting puts combined government support at more than 148 million Canadian dollars, including more than 76 million Canadian dollars from the federal side, with a projected regional economic impact near 500 million Canadian dollars. Those are big numbers. But the bigger story is the strategy behind them. Canada is not just helping one company buy new equipment. Canada is using tariffs, import controls, worker aid, direct funding, procurement policy, and industrial support to rebuild steel capacity at home. This is not a random spending announcement. It is part of a wider response to U.S. trade pressure and global steel overcapacity. That is the part many people are missing. For years, steel was treated by many politicians as an old economy issue. Heavy industry, old jobs, Rust Belt politics, something important but not always treated as modern. Then the world changed. Supply chains broke. Tariffs returned. Wars exposed energy weakness. Governments started asking where critical materials actually come from, and suddenly steel was not old anymore. It was strategic. You cannot build pipelines with press releases. You cannot move natural gas with speeches. You cannot expand energy exports with slogans. You need mills. You need skilled workers. You need pipe. You need supply chains that still work when foreign governments change the rules. And Canada has learned that lesson the hard way. The wider policy backdrop is clear. Canada has been responding to U.S. tariffs and global steel overcapacity. Ottawa has tightened steel import quotas, placed a 25% tariff on targeted steel derivatives, strengthened border enforcement, and argued that these moves could create more than 1 billion Canadian dollars in domestic steel demand. That means Canada is trying to do two things at once. It is trying to block unfair or excess steel from flooding the market, and it is trying to create demand for Canadian-made steel so companies have a reason to invest, hire, and expand. The Tenaris announcement fits directly into that plan. This is why Sault Ste. Marie matters beyond Sault Ste. Marie. This is not just about Northern Ontario. It is about whether Canada can turn trade pressure into industrial rebuilding. It is about whether public money can help create private production. It is about whether Canada can protect workers without simply raising costs for everyone else. Because there is a real tension here. Steel protection can help steel workers, it can help mills, it can help domestic suppliers, but steel is also an input. Other companies buy it. Builders buy it, energy firms buy it, manufacturers buy it. If prices rise too much, those downstream companies feel the pain. If tariffs protect one group but raise costs for another, the policy gets complicated fast. That is why this story cannot be told as pure celebration. It is a major announcement. It is a serious industrial move. It could strengthen Canada's energy supply chain, but it is not guaranteed to succeed just because politicians stood in front of cameras and called it historic. The plant still has to deliver. The jobs still have to appear. The production increase still has to happen. The demand still has to be there. And the costs still have to make sense for the companies that buy the pipe. That is the test. Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Subscribers here get the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story, because the surface version says Canada is spending money on steel, while the full story shows Canada trying to change who has leverage when tariffs, energy, and national projects collide. And leverage is the key word. Canada's economy is deeply tied to the United States. That connection has brought huge benefits for decades. The two countries share supply chains, energy systems, manufacturing networks, and one of the most important trade relationships in the world. But when the United States uses tariffs, that same connection becomes a pressure point. If most of your exports go to one market, that market has power. If your steel industry depends heavily on access to the US, Washington has leverage. If your closest ally can also become your biggest trade threat, your industrial policy starts to change. That is what Canada is doing now. Canada is not breaking away from the United States. That would be impossible and damaging. The two economies are too connected. But Canada is trying to reduce the risk of being cornered. It is trying to build more at home. It is trying to make Canadian projects use more Canadian steel. It is trying to create a stronger domestic market so the next tariff shock does not hit as hard. The Tenaris project is one piece of that shield. Think about the order of events. First, trade pressure grows. Then imports become a threat. Then the government tightens quotas. Then tariffs are added on targeted steel products. Then Ottawa announces support for steel innovation. Then worker retraining programs are tied to the sector. Then procurement rules and tariff response packages become part of the plan. Then Tenaris announces a major expansion in Sault Ste. Marie. That is not random. That is a strategy taking shape. Canada is saying if the world is moving into a new era of trade conflict, then steel cannot be left exposed. If energy security matters, then energy pipe matters. If national projects matter, then the materials behind those projects matter. If allies are using industrial policy, then Canada cannot be the only country pretending the old rules still apply. This is why the announcement has political weight. For Ottawa, it shows action. The federal government can say it is not just complaining about tariffs, it is investing in capacity, it is supporting workers, it is defending a strategic industry. It is trying to turn a trade fight into a long-term industrial plan. For Ontario, it supports the message that manufacturing still matters. Doug Ford's government can point to jobs, investment, steel, energy, and Northern Ontario. That is powerful politics in a province where manufacturing identity still runs deep. For Sault Ste. Marie, this is personal. Industrial announcements are not abstract there. They become paychecks. They become apprenticeships. They become contracts for local suppliers. They become business for restaurants, truckers, electricians, mechanics, and families who depend on the steel economy. But for Canada as a whole, the question is bigger. Can this country still build the hard things it needs? That is the real question underneath the headline. Canada wants more energy infrastructure. Canada wants to move resources to new markets. Canada wants LNG capacity. Canada wants stronger supply chains. Canada wants to protect workers. Canada wants to reduce dependence on foreign steel. Canada wants to stand up to U.S. trade pressure without damaging the U.S. relationship beyond repair. That is a difficult balance. For American viewers, this story matters because it shows how U.S. tariff pressure is changing the behavior of allies. Washington may see tariffs as leverage, but the country receiving that pressure does not just stand still. It adapts. It builds around the pressure. It looks for new tools. It starts asking whether dependence on the U.S. market has become too risky. That does not mean Canada becomes anti-American. It means Canada becomes more defensive. And that defensive shift can change North America. A stronger Canadian steel pipe sector could help North American energy security. It could make the region less dependent on foreign supply. It could support projects that benefit both countries. But if both sides keep moving toward tariffs, domestic preferences, and industrial walls, the continent could become less efficient and more politically tense. That is the contradiction. The US wants stronger allies, but tariff pressure can make allies build protective systems against US unpredictability. Canada wants access to the American market, but repeated trade shocks push Canada to strengthen its own market. Both sides say they want resilience, but resilience can look like duplication, higher costs, and less trust. And steel sits right in the middle of that tension. Do you think Canada is right to use tariffs, public money, procurement rules, and worker support to rebuild steel capacity? Or does that risk making everything more expensive? And should the United States see this as a stronger ally investing in North American security, or as a warning that tariffs are pushing Canada to rely less on Washington? That is not a simple debate. There are strong arguments on both sides. Supporters of Canada's strategy will say the country cannot afford to be passive. They will say global steel overcapacity can destroy domestic producers if governments do nothing. They will say US tariffs prove that even close allies can turn trade into a weapon. They will say energy infrastructure is too important to depend on fragile foreign supply. They will say workers in steel towns deserve a future, not just sympathy after layoffs. And they have a point. But critics will ask hard questions too. They will ask how much protection is too much. They will ask whether public money is being used wisely. They will ask whether tariffs and quotas could raise prices for builders, manufacturers, and energy companies. They will ask whether consumers end up paying indirectly through higher project costs. They will ask whether political announcements are being sold as guaranteed success before the results are proven. They also have a point. That is why the Tenaris announcement should be taken seriously, but not blindly. It is a major industrial move. It strengthens a critical part of the steel pipe supply chain. It could add jobs and boost domestic output. It fits a wider Canadian strategy to answer tariffs and overcapacity, but it is still a bet, a serious bet, a costly bet. A bet that Canada can use government action to rebuild industrial strength without making the economy less competitive. This is the challenge every Western country is facing now. For decades, governments chased low prices, open markets, and global supply chains. That lowered costs for many consumers, but it also made countries dependent on faraway producers for critical goods. Then came shocks, a pandemic, shipping chaos, wars, energy crises, tariffs, political instability. Suddenly, cheap supply did not look as safe as it once did. Now, governments are trying to bring parts of production back home. The United States is doing it. Europe is doing it. China has long done it. Canada is now doing it more openly. But rebuilding industry is not like flipping a switch. You need capital. You need skills. You need demand. You need infrastructure. You need energy. You need policy stability. You need companies to believe the rules will not change every 6 months. And you need workers who can see a real future in the trades and industrial production. That is why the worker piece matters. Canada has tied its steel push to retraining and upskilling programs, including support for thousands of steel workers. That is important because machinery alone does not create industrial strength. Skilled workers do. Welders, operators, engineers, maintenance crews, electricians, millwrights, logistics workers, and technicians turn investment into output. A modern steel pipe facility is not just steel and machines. It is knowledge. It is timing. It is safety. It is quality control. It is decades of industrial skill carried by people whose work often gets ignored until the supply chain breaks. The Tenaris expansion puts those workers back in the center of the story, and that may be the most important political message of all. Canada is telling steelworkers that they are not relics of the past. It is telling them they are part of national security, energy security, and economic sovereignty. It is telling them the country still needs what they know how to build, but the country also has to prove it, because workers have heard promises before, communities have heard speeches before, factories have seen politicians arrive for cameras and leave before the hard part begins. The hard part is not the announcement. The hard part is the years after the announcement, when production targets must be met, markets must be won, and public money must show results. That is where this story goes next. If Tenaris delivers the output increase, if the jobs arrive, if Canadian energy projects use more Canadian pipe, and if the broader steel strategy creates real demand, then Sault Ste. Marie could become proof that Canada can rebuild industrial muscle under pressure. But if costs rise, if demand falls, if trade tensions worsen, or if the policy support becomes a permanent crutch instead of a bridge to competitiveness, then the same announcement could become a warning about the limits of government-led industrial strategy. That is the difference between a headline and a turning point. A headline happens in one day. A turning point takes years to prove. Right now, Canada has made its move. It has put money behind domestic production. It has linked steel to energy. It has tied tariffs to industrial rebuilding. It has sent a message that it does not want to remain exposed to foreign steel shocks or U.S. trade pressure. That message is real, but the outcome is still open. For Canada, the next test is whether the strategy can create long-term strength instead of short-term protection. For the United States, the next test is whether Washington understands that tariff pressure can change how allies think. For workers, the next test is whether the promised jobs become stable careers. For businesses, the next test is whether Canadian steel capacity improves supply security without pushing costs too high. And for the global market, the signal is unmistakable. The old trade world is fading. Countries are no longer assuming that the cheapest supplier is always the safest supplier. They are asking who makes the steel, who controls the pipe, who owns the supply chain, who can keep building when tariffs hit, who can still produce when foreign markets turn unstable. That is the world behind the Tenaris announcement. Not a simple factory upgrade, not a local ribbon cutting, not a one-day political event. A steel pipe plant in Sault Ste. Marie has become part of a much larger fight over energy, sovereignty, and power. If you believe the US and Canada deserve honest, clear coverage, not spun headlines and corporate talking points, this channel was built for you. Subscribe and stand with every viewer who refuses to look away from what is really happening, because the next stage of this story will not be decided by one announcement, but by whether North America can rebuild industry without breaking the alliance that made it powerful. So the Tenaris announcement is not just a check, not just a mill upgrade, and not just a local job story. It is Canada's clearest bet yet that the steel pipe under its energy future should be made closer to home. But the next question is harder. If Canada builds an industrial shield around steel, will Washington see a stronger ally or a neighbor learning how to live with less American leverage? In my next video, I am covering how Canada's tariff fight could reshape North American energy routes, and what I found will change how you see this.